first question that I have for you, because yeah, many, not only Maori, but also like Indigenous women look up to you, because you've been with OHCHR, PGA advisor, you're now associate professor to the University of Auckland. Can you point to a specific personal quality that you have which led to where you are right now? And maybe for people, for Indigenous women, girls, what would you tell them who want to be or beyond where you are, you know, or where you are when they grew up? If that makes sense, sorry.
Kia ora for that, Ghazali. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. And just to everyone, I'm from Ngāti Whakauwea, which is also an iwi in central North Island. It's really funny having questions like that, because I certainly don't see myself as someone that one should particularly look up to, actually. And I think about the people, particularly the women who have guided me and guided in the Indigenous movement, who have made such a tremendous contribution, and I think about their qualities, and I guess some of the qualities that I've admired in those women, and something I hope that I can emulate to some extent, is a level of persistence and determination. I think there are unique issues, I think, facing Indigenous women, and they are not the same across different regions. But I think that determination is really important, that idea that if you set your mind to a particular goal, that you persevere. And I think you see that coming through in the Indigenous movement generally, but also with particular characters, like I think of Andrea Carmen, for example. I think of Miena. I think of, you know, lots of them. I shouldn't start daily. I shouldn't start naming Vicky. I really shouldn't start naming, because it's the list is long. But I think in the Indigenous movement, we've outlasted many of the state delegates, just because we're not doing this as a job particularly, or for some of us it is a job too, but it's not, your motivation is not employment. Your motivation is Indigenous people's rights. And so the determination pays off, and you might have moments, and I can certainly remember moments in the declaration negotiations where it just seemed futile and you weren't going to get anywhere and you couldn't see a way through, and then suddenly there'd be some unexpected breakthrough, and it might have been because particular delegates on the state side changed, and then you had a new dynamic, or policy might change. And so I think that determination is something I would really stress. I see that now in the enhancing Indigenous people's participation at the UN process, which has been a really rocky road, and it's not finished, and we haven't yet achieved what we want to achieve. But I think the determination will pay off in the end, because you're arguing for what is just and what is right. And I think trying to be positive at the end of the day, it might be small steps and then the surprise big step, but at the end of the day, if you persevere, that justice in the arguments will win over.
You touched upon enhanced participation.
Yeah.
As a PGA advisor, and thank you so much for doing that as well. Really appreciate
sure.
it for that.
It was a privilege.
Hopefully you continue in the process, of course. Last year's enhanced participation have been very challenging.
Yes.
Anything that you think, just your thoughts, your observations, Indigenous people should do to turn that around?
Yes, I think we need really cohesive cross-regional support and energy. And that's a hard thing to ask for. And one thing that I've noticed as a change in the Indigenous movement is that Indigenous advocates are spread quite thinly across a range of issues, be it human rights, be it climate change, be it, whatever the issues will be. Sorry about the noise in the background. But I think that if we can galvanise sufficient Indigenous support cross-regionally, and sort out our own internal issues first, so that they can't be exploited by states who are less enthused by the idea of greater participation, then I think we'll get a lot further. So, for example, there's been a tension between, I think, particularly North American and Māori, for example, Indigenous peoples from those states who really have some traction within their states, because it's not participation is something that those states support. But there are states, I'm thinking especially of Asia and some of Africa, where there's complete and utter rejection of greater participation, particularly in the GA. So I think if Indigenous peoples in all those regions can come together and very strongly sort out what our internal issues and the differences are, and have a strategy around that we will get a lot further. And we do have, as Indigenous peoples, different objectives. Increased participation at the UN is for some Indigenous peoples not necessarily a priority, because there are other pressing priorities, be they domestic or other pressing priorities at the international level. You know, I named some other issues ongoing, like climate change clearly is an important one. So yeah, we need to work together in that way, and that's quite hard now at the moment with travel restrictions and that kind of thing. But I do wonder, and I've been reflecting on this over the last week actually, I do wonder whether the sort of coronavirus era might be something that we can use in a, I mean, I don't want to say positive way, because there's nothing much positive about coronavirus at all, but whether there's an opportunity there to get some traction at the UN when people are thinking about other things. And sometimes that's not a bad thing to do. And there have been some leaps made when sort of a little bit under the radar. And I wonder whether we can do something there, and that requires coordination too. And there's some tremendous leadership coming through, which I've been heartened to see.
Thank you so much for that, because I 100% agree with what you're saying. One more question to pick your brain a little bit more about PGA, about your role as a PGA advisor.
Yeah.
What can people learn from how you interacted with the states as an advisor? Like, what did you see, and what is this one thing that you would like to convey or transmit to other Indigenous peoples?
I'm not sure if I've got one thing.
Whatever
There'd be
comes
quite
up.
a few things, but there's lots of things going through my mind. One thing, so I was a co-Indigenous advisor with three advisors, but another Indigenous advisor, which was James Anaya. I think he and I tag teamed quite well on the good cop, bad cop kind of role in dealing with states. Having someone like Jim Anaya meant that you had the kind of legal authority, like he's probably the most well-known international lawyer on Indigenous people's rights globally. So having his expertise in what we would call mana was really important. I think one thing that in that sort of the four of us working together, we could take on particular roles, and so the state advisors were a lot better in kind of dealing with the states directly. Jim and I took more of a role in liaising, I guess, between Indigenous groups and state groups. I think you have to build on relationships with states, and then in some cases we had, and I would say with a couple of delegates, the relationships weren't that good, and you had to invest a lot of energy in trying to have to communicate with one another, but a lot of people take it really personally, and I think that was a hard lesson for me to learn, was that not to take it personally, but to keep building and trying to maintain relationships. So there's a few ideas in there, I think, but the process wasn't terribly, I mean, was it? It wasn't, I wouldn't say it was unsuccessful. I think we made a lot of ground, but at the end of the day, in this most recent process, I think the states who were less enthusiastic about, or downright objecting to increased enhanced participation for Indigenous peoples, they were very clever at coming together and exploiting issues around the definition of Indigenous peoples, exploiting issues around the sort of state-centric nature of the United Nations. I mean, you're trying to get into a club, if you like, that is state-centric, and it's those very states that have colonized and oppressed Indigenous peoples. Like, there's some deeply structural problem and issue there, and they were very good at exploiting that. So you have to try, and I think in the future it'd be good to realize that and strategizing together in a way to come up with arguments that respond to that well. And
this is a different question, and I think that this can be very interesting, maybe a little bit more fun for you as well. Honest assessment, or like your thoughts on Indigenous people's sovereignty. What do you see? What would you like to see? Maybe that's a better question. And maybe, well, like, what's the first step that Indigenous peoples can take on that?
So on the sovereignty question, I'd prefer to focus more on Aotearoa, just because I wouldn't want to speak or have no real authority with respect to other Indigenous peoples' claims to sovereignty. I think in Aotearoa, well, I don't know actually where to start in a way, but in Aotearoa, there is a big movement for greater sovereignty. There always has since the first time of colonisation. I think we're really coming to a point where there's some willingness to entertain fundamental constitutional transformation when there's realising the sovereignty that was guaranteed under our Treaty of Waitangi. And I think that is that's come up because it's a question of time, and people realise that New Zealand's constitutional structure remains illegitimate until there's recognition of Māori sovereignty and recognition of that in some way. You know, there's every day I think it's important to question the state's claim to absolute sovereignty and to assert sovereignty, and in the coronavirus era, what we did see was Māori asserting sovereignty to protect their own borders around our own tribal boundaries, and that was really important. And that was I think has led to some advances, because the state was quite keen on that, because they then could focus resources elsewhere. It was, you know, in that confusing time of just trying to protect people from getting coronavirus. So that assertion of sovereignty was kind of well received at that particular moment, and that was really important, and regulation allowed for that. So I can see my daughter coming in. So pop it, Danny. It's not a good time to go through. Yeah. No, Danny, it's time to go out. So, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. So the other thing is I think with the sovereignty movement is to combine with the international movement is really important. So that it's really important for Māori to be working with other Indigenous peoples to see what is possible and what is appropriate for forms of sovereignty in 2020. Is it complete absolute independence, or is it shared jurisdiction, or is it something, or personal jurisdiction over people. Like, how do you realize? How do you do that, kind of practically, to realize our aspirations? One interesting and difficult thing I feel is that we're getting to a stage where stand up and exercise, and trying to find those expertise and governance authority and a governance power, and to do that well for such a long time because you've been oppressed and colonized. So that's a challenge, I think, for Indigenous people, working out how to do that properly.
Yeah, final question is, like, do you have anything that we didn't touch upon that you still want to talk about a little bit more, or want any people to think about maybe?
Yeah. I think, I mean, not especially. We've covered some good ground. Thank you, Ghazali. I've enjoyed talking to you. But I think on Indigenous people, on the participation topic, I think it would be really good if we can come together to have the energy that we need to progress that issue, because I do think it is important, even if not obviously for all Indigenous peoples. It's not me to speak for other Indigenous peoples, but nonetheless, I do think it's important for all of us. Because if we want to get into these structures that undermine our own sovereignty movements, it's really important that you get into those really important state-based clubs and change them, because otherwise those structural impediments will continue to be a barrier preventing us moving forward. So I think it might not look like it's got any immediate tangible outcomes particularly, but changing the structure is essential for us to really get where we want to go in terms of sovereignty and rights, I think.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'll let you go now.
Thank you.
So much
Sorry, I'm going to go
being
and
with
cook
us.
those munchkins dinner now.